Hello, hello, and welcome to another crochet tutorial. Today happens to be a very gloomy and stormy day, and I thought, what more perfect day could there be to start a new sweater project? So today I'm going to be showing you how to make your very own Vinland men's pullover, which was featured in the November issue of 2023 of Crochet Foundry magazine. And so I'm going to be walking you through some of the steps about how to create your own version of this sweater. So to get started, we are going to need a few supplies. So first of all, we're going to need to talk yarn. So the yarn that I'm using is the Whims Merino. This is a DK weight. It is by Furls Fiber Arts. It is 50% merino, 50% nylon, and it is a special kind of Z-twist crochet yarn, which means that it's going to give us some really great stitch definition. And the combination of the superwash merino and the nylon makes it very soft and squishy and bouncy. Unfortunately, this yarn is going to be discontinued. So right now it is on super sale as of the time of this recording, but once they're sold out, they're pretty much just done. So I do actually provide alternatives in the original pattern as well as in the description box below for other types of yarn you can use if for some reason you're unable to get a hold of your own sweater's quantity of Whims Merino. Now the hooks you're going to need. You can see I have two of them here. You can most likely get away with just using one, but I do have two here for a reason. So one is that this is our primary hook we are going to be using. This is the G hook. This is a 4mm. This is my Streamline in Camwood by Furls. This is going to be the hook that we will be using for the majority of the sweater. However, we are going to be doing a slip stitch ribbing, and slip stitch ribbing can be a bit finicky, especially if you might crochet a little tighter. So I do suggest that if you need to go up a hook size, so I have my H 5mm hook here as an option for if you need to loosen up your ribbing. Now that we know yarn and hooks, here are our notions. So we are going to need a pair of scissors for cutting and some yarn needles. Sorry. You'll just need one really because we will be weaving in ends, but this is a top-down seamless construction, so you won't need anything to seam, thank goodness. You'll also need a measuring tape to be able to measure not only the garment, but also whoever is going to be wearing it, whether that's yourself or the person you might be making this sweater for, or both, because you want to make sure that it's absolutely fitting the way that you want it to. And then the most crucial part, besides the hooks and the yarn, is going to be your stitch markers. Now, the way the vine motifs work is that there are going to be different increase points that have to happen, and we mark those using stitch markers. So one is that you're going to need to have a set of just stitch markers that are kind of generic set. It'll tell you in the pattern how many you'll need for your size, but then you'll also want one stitch marker that's unique from your other set, and this is going to be our beginning of round stitch marker. We're going to be working rounds continuously without joining or turning, and it can be very easy to get lost on what round we're on if we don't know exactly which one our first stitch is. So having one of these on hand to mark your beginning of round, distinct from the ones that mark our increase points, is going to be very important. Now that we have all our supplies, it is time to get started on our sweater. So let's get started with the gauge swatch. It is very important when you're making any kind of wearable crochet garment that you make up a gauge swatch of some kind. So in the pattern, it gives instructions for how to create your gauge swatch using rows of single crochet, since that's the primary stitch used in this pattern. So I've worked up my gauge swatch here. And then a very important step that I did was made sure I laundered this and then blocked it how I would normally launder and block the actual sweater. So that way I can see how the final stitches are going to settle. So when I first made this, it was not as flat. It was definitely, you know, like curled at the edges and corners and things like that, like crochet can do. But now it's definitely lying a little bit flatter now that I've washed and blocked it. Then what you're going to do is measure out in a few different places, just because there might be some slight variation, just to confirm how many stitches there are in 4 inches. And to do that, each crochet stitch is going to contain a post and then a space of some kind. So that's going to take up the space of 1 stitch. So every time you see a post and a space, you count that as 1. So if you line up your ruler or measuring tape and make sure it's nice and straight, it's not stretched and it's just lying comfortable, you would count, okay, so there's a post and a space, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc., all the way until you get to 4 inches or 10 centimeters, and see how many how many single crochet stitches it is in 4 inches. That will tell you your gauge, and then you can see if you've matched my gauge in the pattern, and if not, you know that you might need to go down a hook size, up a hook size, something like that. The same idea goes when we measure our rows. So my gauge swatch is not quite as big as the one that you'll make because I guess, rushed through. But when you measure your rows, you're going to measure by finding these kind of grooves that are along here. Each one of these grooves, from groove to groove, represents 2 single crochet rows, because the single crochet goes one direction and then looks different when it goes the opposite direction, and then it resets. So you kind of find the bottom of one of these grooves here, and then each one of the, or like the top of this groove, sorry, the right side here where it lines up. And then when you get to the next groove, you'll count that as 2 rows. So there's 2, 4, 6, 8, etc., etc., etc. And then if it's not all the way to the next groove, each one of these little holes represents the next single crochet row. So you can count that as 1 row. And then anything in between, you'd be like half a row. So you would count that and see how many rows you have in 4 inches or 10 centimeters. And then that is your row gauge. Now, it is very important to try to match both gauges as close as possible, but I also know that sometimes it's difficult to match both. And if you can match one or the other, you're usually like, well, which one should I pick? So for this pattern, I would recommend, if you cannot match both gauges, match the stitch gauge, which is the width here. And don't worry as much about row gauge, because the stitch gauge is going to determine the chest circumference, neck circumference, things like that. And that definitely needs to be as accurate as possible. The row gauge just is about lengths of things. So like how long the arms or the sleeves will be, how long the body will be, things like that. So you can always add in or take out extra rows or rounds if you need to be able to match the lengths of things that you need. So there we go. Now that we've done gauge and you've taken your time, hopefully, to do your gauge swatch, you're now ready to get started on the actual sweater. So let's start with the neck ribbing. To begin our Vinland sweater, we're going to start by making the collar ribbing around the neck. And to do that, we are going to make a slip knot. Place that on our hook. And then depending on your size, you're going to chain a certain number. So I'll chain 5 here. And then what we'll do is work slip stitches into each one of these chains across, starting with the second one. So second chain for my hook, I'll insert my hook, yarn over, and just pull my yarn through everything on there. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that we are going to be working into these slip stitches later. So you want to make sure that you're not pulling these too tightly. You don't want them to be too loose either. Slip stitches can be a little bit finicky. You still want them to be a nice, neat rib. But if they're too tight, they're nearly impossible to work into. So once you do slip stitches in each of those chains across, you'll now have however many it is for your size, so 4, 6, or 8. And then you're going to chain 1. And then what I recommend is tightening down this last chain that we just did, just to keep a neater edge. And then we'll turn, and then we will find the back loop. So for slip stitches, they tend to kind of lean away from us when we turn our work. So we will need to turn it towards us pretty sharply to be able to see those back loops. So these back loops are going to be these ones right here away from us. So we're going to insert our hook into that back loop, yarn over, pull through everything, and then do that again in the other slip stitches. So there's 2, and then 3, 3, and then this last one is way here. So if we look here, we've got this loop right here. That's going to be our last back loop to work into right there. And there we go. And then we just basically repeat the row we just did. So we will chain 1, tighten that down, turn, and then with a relaxed tension, work slip stitches into the back loop of each slip stitch across. Now in places like this, sometimes it's a little hard to see that last one, but if we look to see where the V is of the stitch that we just worked into and find where the V is of this last stitch, we can see that it is formed by this loop and then this little loop kind of tucked right here. So that little loop is the back loop I'm going to work into. So I'll stick my hook in, kind of pull it up there, and then I'm able to work my slip stitch into it. And there we go. And then you just keep doing that over and over again until you form the number of rows that it says for your size in the pattern. Now, I'm not going to lie. This part sucks. I mean, slip stitch ribbing, I think, is my least favorite ribbing, honestly, to crochet because of how small and finicky and just like the work that it takes for it. However, when you look at the final result, it looks really good. It creates these beautiful little tight V ridges. It looks really just like that polished, clean knit ribbing that you see on these like really nice sweaters. So to me, for this sweater, it was worth it for the look that I wanted to go for. So that's why I opted to go for one of the worst types of ribbing as far as crochet process, but product result, oh, it's gonna look so good. So definitely take some time, be patient. It is gonna take a little bit, but once you work them all up, you're going to love the way it looks in the end. So I'm going to spend a while going ahead and making my ribbing, and then I will meet you back to show you how to join to form the collar. And now, as you can see, we have this nice, big, beautiful collar. We can see that those little V stitches, those slip stitches create that nice little tight rib, but it's also very, very super stretchy, but then just bounces right back into place. It's the perfect type of rib for this project. So now that I've gotten all of my rows completed, one thing we're going to be doing is the join. So you should always end on an even numbered row for no matter what size you're doing. So you should end on a wrong side row. And so what we'll do is we're going to chain 1, and now we're going to turn it to the right side. And we can see on the right side here that we have this last ridge of slip stitches that we worked into the back loop. And if you look on top here, we've got still, the loops here. But what we're going to do is join this ridge. If we keep our collar straight here. Our very first set of stitches here, which is going to be this groove right here. So what that'll do is it basically will place this ridge on top of that groove and create this little seamless looking transition so that you can't tell exactly where the joint is unless you were just looking very, very carefully for it. So matching up and making sure that my collar is straight. And we have our right side facing. We're going to match up stitch for stitch. So if I see here, I've got my first stitch right here. So I'm going to actually go under both loops of that slip stitch, both loops. And then I'm going to find the first kind of gap here, this first hole. So there should be the same number of gaps here in the chain. I'll go through that first gap. And then now that my hook is through the first row, my last row, and this loop, I'm going to slip stitch through all of that. So I'll grab my yarn, pull through everything on the hook. You can actually make that kind of tight because we're not going to be working into that stitch later. There we go. Okay, so now that we've done that, we just repeat that with the other stitches. So I'm going to find my next one, go under both loops of that slip stitch, go through that second hole of my first row, grab my yarn, and then pull it through everything. And there we go. And then we do that with the other two. So find my third one. And then my last one. Again, the last one might be tucked a little farther back. So just find that V that's on the top and then just go through both of those loops. And then find our very last stitch here. Grab our yarn and slip stitch through everything. And there we go. Okay, then if I take my hook out here for a moment, it'll let me, there we go. If we turn our work this direction, we can now see that we've got that join here, and we can always take our tail yarn and we can weave it through here and kind of like tighten anything up that we might need to. If we feel like, we need to polish anything, that's fine. But otherwise, you pretty much now have a joined collar. And one thing you'll want to make sure that you do is test out this collar to make sure it fits over your head or the head of whoever you're making it for. And that it should be able to stretch quite a bit, and then it'll spring back to where the regular neck is going to be. And you'll want to make sure that it fits nice and comfortably. Once you do that, you're now actually ready to start setting up to work the yoke, which is going to be the next part. When beginning the yoke, one thing you'll notice is that we've got our yarn is coming from here through our neckband. What we want to do is go ahead and just take our yarn and just pull it through the neck and then out so that it is always on the outside instead of coming up underneath our neck. So once we do that, we're ready to start working the first round. So the first round is a setup round essentially. And what this does is it puts stitches into the sides of our ribbing so that we have something to work into later for our actual design. So each rib is going to have a ridge and a groove. Now you're going to have twice as many rows as you are stitches because of how tight that the slip stitching rows can be. So we're going to actually be skipping rows to work these next stitches. So I'm going to pull up here and we're going to work a single crochet into every groove. So in these little dips here, I'm going to find that first stitch here of the groove, insert my hook, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through two. And then we've got our first single crochet. Now the next thing about this is that because we are working our rounds continuously without any turning, we're going to want to grab our stitch markers. So our beginning of the round stitch marker is going to be used to mark the first stitch of the round. So now that I've made my first single crochet, I'm ready to start working my next one. So we're going to skip this ridge and work into the next groove of our ribbing. So then I will insert my hook into that first stitch here. And there's my single crochet. And then skip the ridge, go into the next groove and single crochet. And it doesn't really matter where in the groove you're sticking your hook. I mean, I'm choosing to just kind of put it through this one strand of yarn that's just right here, but you could put it into this strand right here. You could put it into this one here if you want to get more loops over your hook to get a more tight or secure stitch. For me, I find that putting it through this one is just fine. And it's a little easier for me. So you do whatever's easiest for you, but that's essentially all you're going to do for this first round is just work single crochets into every groove of your ribbing. And then I will do that off camera and I will meet you back to show you how to do the next round. I just finished up working into this final groove here and I have the correct number of stitches. So you'll want to definitely make sure of your stitch count. If for some reason you're off by one or something like that, just do maybe like an extra one in here and then you should be good. But now it's time to begin round two where we are going to be doing our first set of increases. So we have our beginning of the round stitch marker, but now what you're going to want to do is grab more stitch markers because those are going to be marking where we will do our increase points. In your pattern, it's going to tell you how many you will need by the end. So if you want to just like gather up that many plus your beginning of the round stitch marker, then have those ready. So what we're going to do is without joining and without turning or anything, we're just going to start working single crochets directly into this very first stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and remove my beginning of round stitch marker and then work my single crochet into that first stitch. And then I will want to place my beginning of round marker into that first stitch. There we go, to mark my new beginning of round. And that counts as my first stitch of the next instruction. So then it'll tell you to work a certain number of stitches depending on your size. Then in the next stitch, we are going to be doing a single crochet increase. Now, typically for most patterns, a single crochet increase, you would just put 2 single crochets into the same stitch. But because I want the single crochet increases to not be as conspicuous, I actually do what is called an invisible single crochet increase. So what you do is instead of working a single crochet into both loops, we're actually just going to work a single crochet starting in this back loop. So I'm going to go through the back loop only of my stitch, create a single crochet, then going under both loops of my stitch, the same stitch, create my second single crochet. And what that does is, if you'll notice, the single crochet here is no different than any of the single crochets that I've just worked in before. They're not having this giant gap from having 2 stitches being thrown into it. And this other single crochet is kind of tucked in between the 2 stitches on either side, almost like it's sitting between the 2 stitches. So that creates a nice little invisible increase that doesn't look like just 2 stitches coming out of the same stitch. So once I do that, I'm then going to take a stitch marker and place it into that last single crochet I just made. So now I've increased from 7, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There were 8 stitches here. Now I've increased it up to 9 stitches total. So that's what we're going to be doing all the way around, is working whatever number of stitches you need to work for your size. Followed by working the single crochet increase, doing the invisible one where we work through the back loop, then we work through both loops, and then placing another stitch marker into that last stitch we just made. And so when you get all the way back around, you should find that your very last stitch here is going to have an increase in it, and we're going to still place a stitch marker in it because that will remind us that that's one that we will need to eventually do more increases into. So I'm going to continue working mine off camera, and then I will meet you back once it's time to begin round 3. I'm coming now to my very last stitch, so this should be where my final increase will go. And then place my last stitch marker. There we go. All right. Now round 3 is where the fun begins. We are going to be establishing where our post stitches are going to start creating those vine patterns. So to do that, we're going to work into the first 3 single crochets, just regular single crochets. So I'll go ahead and do 1 in my first stitch. Go ahead and place my beginning of round marker there. And then work 2 and 3. Okay. Now in the next part, it says that you're going to work a front post double crochet around the top stitch of your ribbing. So that's going to be this stitch right here. So if you see we have our 4 stitches or 6 or 8, whatever you might have, your top one is going to be this one that's right here. But it says you're also going to go 1 ridge to the left. So for me, this would be the one, if I look at my stitch here, I would normally have worked into this one. The ridge right below is this one. The one to the left is just this one right here. So I'm going to work a front post double crochet around this top stitch of this ridge. So I'll yarn over, go around that top stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2. And that will create a right leaning front post double crochet. If I had done it around this ridge, it would just be going straight up and down, but I want it to be leaning to the right. So that's why I went over 1 ridge to the left. Now, with all the post stitches in this pattern, because a post stitch counts as 1 stitch, we don't want to work into the stitch that's directly behind it. So we're going to skip whatever single crochet might be directly behind the stitch we just made so that our stitch count stays the same. So I'll skip that one, go into this next one, and then it'll say to work a certain number of single crochets. So I'll go ahead and work that, which looks like it's just 1. Okay, there we go. And then it says that I'm going to work a front post V-stitch around the top stitch of the one directly below. So if I remember that a V-stitch is 3 stitches across here, that means that I'm going to find the center ridge just below. So if we look here, it's going to be 1, 2. It's going to be 2 ridges to the left of the one that we just worked. So to do a V-stitch, we're going to yarn over, go around that stitch here, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2. So that creates our very first side of our V. So that's one side of the V. We go ahead and skip that single crochet, go into the next one, and we work a single crochet to create a space. And then we're going to go back into that same stitch here, and we're going to work another V-stitch. So we're going to yarn over, go around the same stitch we formed that first front post stitch around, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2. And then that creates a little front post V-stitch, creates that little V. And because we worked another front post double crochet, we're going to skip this single crochet. Now, if you'll notice on my size, the very next stitch is a stitch marker stitch. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to need to work a single crochet into that. For some of the sizes, this stitch is going to be the one you will be skipping, so you actually don't need to work another single crochet. So if that's the case, you just immediately start repeating this pattern that we just worked here, where we work the 3 singles, we work our front post double, single, and V-stitch. But for my size, I do need to work into this marked stitch, a single crochet, then I'll go ahead and put my stitch marker back in. And now I'm ready to repeat. Okay, so I'm going to go through that one more time, and then you should be good to be able to go. So we're going to work the 3 single crochets here. So we'll do 1, 2, 3. And then if I find my next stitch would be here, I'd go down and see that that's the ridge directly below, but I want to go to the one to the left of that to create my lean. So I will go yarn over, go around this stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2. Okay. Then skip the single crochet behind, work a single crochet into the next one, and then I will work my V-stitch. So across these next 3 stitches, I find the ridge that's to the center of that. It should be right about here. If you eyeball it, it should be good. So it should be, 2 to the left here. So yarn over, go around, yarn over, pull up a loop, pull through 2, pull through 2. Then skipping the single crochet behind that double crochet, work a single crochet into the next one. Here we go. And then front post double around the same stitch we just worked our last front post double around, just like this. And there we go. And now our V-stitch is completed. So if you have one of the sizes that needs that extra single crochet to work into this marked stitch, you'll go ahead and do that. If not, one thing I forgot to mention earlier is that you will want to go ahead and move your stitch marker into the last stitch. So if you are doing one of the sizes where this last stitch that we skipped was a marked stitch, you'll want to take it out of that stitch and then place it into the last front post double crochet of your V-stitch. So that way you know that that's the last stitch of this set of repeats. So make sure that you're doing that. So then that way on the next round, you'll know where to still put your increases, because we'll still be increasing at these points where our stitch markers are. So that's what you're going to be doing for the remainder of the round, is just repeating that series of stitches over and over, where you would do the single crochets, the front post leaning double crochet, single crochet between, and then your V-stitch, and depending on your size, doing an extra single crochet. If not, just moving the stitch marker up into your last stitch that you just made. So I will work the remainder of that off camera and meet you back for round 4. Round 4 is where we start establishing our official increase pattern. So in the instructions, it will say that you're just going to basically single crochet all the way to the stitch marker. You'll work your increase in the marked stitch and then continue repeating that around. So while it might be, simple enough instructions, sometimes it can be a bit of a challenge knowing exactly where you need to work when you start getting into some of these post stitches. So that's what I'm going to be showing here for you today. So first I'm going to work a single crochet into my very first stitch, and then I will go ahead and mark it with my beginning of round marker. And then single crocheting into these single crochets is just as straightforward as it seems. But then when we get to one of these post stitches, sometimes depending on how you might be looking, it might be a little difficult to tell. But if you look, each of these post stitches has its own V at the top, just like any other crochet stitch. And then behind it, you're going to see the single crochet that might be tucked back there. Now, what you want to make sure of is you don't accidentally work in this skipped single crochet. That is one row below. You don't want to work into that one. You always want to make sure you're working in the top V of the post stitch. So always make sure that your work is turned nice and flat, and it'll be more obvious to see, oh yeah, after this stitch, the next one to work into will be this one. So that's just a little tip on how to make sure you're working your single crochets into the correct stitch each time. So we're going to keep going. Then when you get to the marked stitch, you'll need to remove the stitch marker, and then you'll just work your invisible increase again. And then once it's made, you will replace the stitch marker back into the last stitch you just made. And then you just keep repeating that over and over, just working single crochets to the stitch marker, working your increase in the marked stitch, replacing that, and then working all the way around. What's great is that every even numbered round going forward for a while in the yoke is just going to be a repeat of these instructions, and that's going to show that increase growing to give room for our vine texture to start growing outward. So every time you hit an even numbered round, just go ahead and repeat these instructions. I just finished working up round 4 off camera. So as you can see, I finished all my increases and my stitch markers are now in place, and I'm ready to begin round 5. So the thing about round 5 is that rounds 5 and 7 are going to be worked very similarly. So I'm just going to be showing you how to do things in round 5. And then when you do round 7, it'll be very similar instructions and techniques. So you should be able to get know how to do that from doing round 5. So the first thing is that you're going to be working your single crochets, however many in the pattern it says to do for your size. And then after that, it's going to say to work a front post double crochet. Now notice that we are all the way over here, and then the next post stitch is all the way over here. So from now on, every single post stitch, whether it's a front post double, front post V-stitch, front post cluster, they're all going to be worked around the next unworked post stitch of the round. So in this case, it's going to be this one over here. Now, even though it's a little far away, that's okay because this is still just to create a right leaning stitch. So to do our front post double crochet, we'll still yarn over, go around this next post, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2. And then that creates our next right leaning front post double crochet. Then we will skip that single crochet behind it just like we do normally. And then we'll work a single crochet here. And then we'll just repeat that. So on our V stitches, because V stitches have 2 posts to them, the next one is going to be this very first post that we'll work around. So after we do this single crochet, we're going to do another right leaning front post double crochet. So we'll yarn over, around that post, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2. And then we will skip this single and then work another single crochet into the next stitch. And then the last instruction is just like what it was down here in round 3, where we're just going to work a V-stitch, but it's this time around this very last post. And just like last time, depending on your size, your last stitch may be the marked stitch, or you may need to do an extra single crochet. So for me, I would do my V-stitch by doing my post, skip, do my single, then I'll work my V-stitch second post around this same post here. And then if I look behind it, the skipped stitch will be this one. And so I have one more stitch that's marked. And so that's going to be where I need to do that extra single crochet. So I'm working on one of the sizes that needs that extra single crochet there. If you also have that, you'll do exactly what I just did. If you are working one of the sizes where you don't work that extra single crochet, you're just going to take the marker from this stitch that you're going to be skipping and just moving it up into this post stitch of our V to mark where you will do your increase on the next round. So there we go. So I will go through that again just one more time here just to make sure you get it. So we've got working some single crochets. Then we will work a front post double crochet around this next unworked post stitch. Skip that stitch behind it, work a single crochet, and then find our next unworked post stitch, which is the right post of this V stitch, and we will work our next front post double crochet around that one. Then we will skip that single, work a single into the next one. And then, depending on our size, we might have 4 stitches left or 3 stitches left. In either case, you still do a V-stitch around this final post. So every post, so like front post double crochet and V-stitch, you're always going to need to work something around it on the following round. So if you find that you have any empty posts by the time you get to your stitch marker, it means you missed something in here. So you'll want to go double check your instructions to make sure that you got all the correct number of post stitches around. Okay, and then we'll do my final single crochet. And that's really all there is to round 5. And in round 7, you're going to be given very similar instructions. There's just going to be more post stitches to work around, but it's all essentially the same. It's front post double crochets and a front post V-stitch there at the end. And then depending on your size, just having that marked stitch at the last one or needing to do a single crochet. So you're going to work that up. And then on round 6, you're going to just repeat round 4. Round 7, you'll do this. Round 8, you'll repeat round 4 again. So I'm going to work a lot of this off camera, and then I will meet you back up to start round 9 when we introduce the final stitch that you're going to need to know to work the texture of this yoke. I just finished up round 8 and we are now ready to start round 9. So round 9 is when we're going to see our next new stitch. So what we'll do is go ahead and remove our first stitch marker. And then what we're going to do is immediately work our very first front post double crochet around this front post double crochet here. Because as you can see, it's been shifting to the right, and now it's about to hit the very first stitch here before it'll make a turn later. So we'll go ahead and yarn over, go around that first front post stitch, complete our front post double crochet, and then we will place our beginning of round stitch marker into that front post stitch. And there we go, first stitch of the round. Then what we'll do is we will work a single crochet after we skip this one that's right behind our front post stitch. So we'll work our single crochet here. And then we will work our very first front post cluster. So what a front post cluster is going to do is it's going to wrap around this front post double crochet, and it's going to form a cluster of a bunch of other front post double crochets that will not be completed until the very end, and then we will connect them all together with one big yarn over and pull through. So in the pattern, how I set it up is to do it with 5 double crochets, but if you find that that's just a little too thick, or you would rather they not be too many wrapped around one, you can always drop it down to something like 3. Or conversely, if you want it even thicker, you want your clusters to be really big, you could always, up it up to 7 or something like that. I find that 5 definitely is a good size for the clusters that I go for. So anyway, enough rambling. Here's how you do a cluster. Okay, so you'll yarn over, you'll go around whatever stitch you need to. So this is the post stitch we'll go around. Yarn over, pull up a loop, then yarn over and pull through the first 2. That is our first incomplete double crochet. We'll now have 2 loops on the hook, the one here and the one here. Then we're going to repeat that again around the same post. So we will yarn over, go around the same post stitch again, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2. So now we have 2 double crochets around our post, so 2 loops on our hook plus the one that we have here. Then I do that again, yarn over, go around the post stitch, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2. That's my third one. And then I yarn over, go around, pull up a stitch, or pull up a loop, yarn over, and then pull through 2. That's 4. And then I need to do one more. So I will yarn over, go around the post. So you can see it starts to get a little crowded around this post, but that's okay. Just put as many there as we can fit, then pull through 2. And then now we will have our 5 incompleted double crochets, plus the one on our loop is going to be a total of 6 loops on our hook. Once we get those 6 loops, it's time to join the top of our cluster together. So we will yarn over and then pull that loop through every single loop on our hook at once. And then just kind of tighten it a bit there. And you can now see that we've got this lovely cluster of stitches that are wrapped around our post stitch here. And that gives it that kind of grapevine look to our pattern here. So now what we'll do is we're going to skip, because this is just one stitch, it only has one V at the top. We're going to skip one single crochet behind it and then work the next single crochet into the stitch after that. And what that does is it cinches that cluster to our fabric. So now it's nice and secure. It's not gonna, flop out or anything like that. And there we go. That is how we do a front post cluster. Then after that, you just continue working the remainder of your stitches like normal. So any front post double crochets and front post V stitches that you have worked before, you're going to continue doing so. And then just work those clusters where you see it says to work a cluster around a post stitch. Now that I've shown you this, you basically are equipped to work the rest of your yoke texture with just these 3 stitches. You have your front post double crochets, your front post V stitches, and your front post clusters. And the only other thing that maybe you might need a little bit of help on is how to work into the tops of these clusters. But if you'll look, by turning your work to the top here, we can see that the cluster, just like all the other stitches, has a V on top. So that's just what you're going to work in whenever it's time to single crochet into a cluster. And so the stitch count should stay the same. You should still have the same number of stitches as before. You're just going to work single, single, single into this V, and then make sure you get the single under this V as well, which is that one single crochet that's kind of going to be tucked a little behind the cluster. But if you always just kind of turn it and look for those V's, it'll be a lot easier to see where you need to work those single crochets. So now that you know how to work all of these types of stitches and how to do the increasing, you're ready to go ahead and tackle the remainder of the yoke. So I will go ahead and work a lot of this up off camera, and then I will meet you back when it's time to do the next step, which will be shifting our stitch markers when it's time to change where we're going to be doing our increases. So you've got quite a bit of work to do ahead of you, so go ahead and work that, and I will meet you back. All right, y'all, we have just finished round 13 and it is now time to begin round 14 where we will be doing our stitch marker shift. Now I know that this part can be a bit confusing, but don't worry, I will be walking through all the steps for it to make it as clear as possible. So the first thing is that we are going to be moving where we do our increases. So we can see here we've got this one strand of front post double crochets that we've been building. It's now time to start giving this the same room we gave this one so that the vines can start growing from this set of front post double crochets. So to do that, what we're going to do is work a single crochet, just one single crochet for now. Since this is the first one of the round, I'll go ahead and put my beginning of round marker in it. Then I'm immediately going to work an increase into this next stitch. So our increase again is just work a single crochet through the back loop, then work a single crochet under both loops. Now we will want to remember where this is located, and it should be easy enough to find because it's the stitches right above where this front post stitch ended, and it does create a slightly larger gap right here. So you can always remember that it is the third stitch right here, or find this hole or find where this post is, and that'll help guide you to where this increase will be. Then the remaining instructions are very similar for all the sizes, but there is going to be a different instruction once we reach the stitch marker. But for now, all you then do is just single crochet across into every stitch. Then once we reach our stitch marker, depending on your size, you're going to have a different instruction for what to do into this stitch. So for the sizes extra small through 1x, you're just going to work a regular single crochet because you have all the stitches you need to continue this pattern. But for sizes 2x through 5x, you're going to need to do one more increase into this marked stitch. Regardless of whichever one you do, you'll remove your stitch marker, work whatever stitch you need to work into that marked stitch, whether it's just this single crochet or the increase. Then, instead of placing your stitch marker back here, we're actually going to shift it to where it's in this increase that we made earlier. So we'll find where our increase was. So in this case, it was this stitch right here. And we're going to place our stitch marker into that stitch. Now it's going to be very close to our beginning of round stitch marker. There should only be one gap here, but that's the only place where that'll happen. The rest of them, we don't have that. And then we'll continue working that as a repeat. So I'll go through that just one more time. So you'll work one single crochet, then in our next stitch, we will work an increase. So we will do single crochet back loop, single crochet both loops, then single crochet into every stitch across to the stitch marker. Remember on these clusters, there's always that one single crochet kind of tucked there in the back that we want to make sure we get. Then when we get to the stitch marker, depending on your size, you'll work a single crochet or a single crochet increase into that stitch. And then replace the stitch marker into the previous increase we worked over here and not in the stitch it originally was. So I'll find that increase here, stick it into that last single crochet that was made for our increase, and then I'm ready to continue. So now you know what you need to do for round 14. So I will continue working that off camera, and then I will meet you back up to talk about instructions for round 15. I've just finished up working round 14, so you can see I've done all of my stitch marker shifts here, and now I'm ready to begin round 15. So starting in round 15, you're going to find that it's not going to give exact instructions for absolutely everything, and instead is going to give you instructions up to this stitch marked stitch. Then it's going to list a vine row that you're going to follow. So I'm going to show you what to do when you get there. So first off, in these first 3 stitches, we're just going to work 2 single crochets and a front post double crochet. So I'll work my first one, place my beginning of round stitch marker in there, work my second one, and then you'll find that our third front post double crochet stitch is going to go into this stitch right here, and it's going to match up over this one with the stitch marker. So what we're going to do is work our front post double crochet. And then because we would skip this stitch right behind it, we're actually going to go ahead and just move this stitch marker up into that front post double crochet stitch. And that will mark the same stitch as it was before in the round before. Now what we're going to do is, after skipping that single crochet, we're going to start following instructions for whatever vine it lists. Now, we are on row 15, but it's vine 11 because the vine numbers are just for the actual like vine instructions, since they repeat in groups of 19, 20 stitches, or sorry, 19, 20 rows. So the vine numbers are just 1 through 19. But they're not going to necessarily line up with the number of rounds that you're working on because you're going to be repeating. So you just have to make sure you're paying close attention to the vine instruction you're supposed to follow, because it won't necessarily match the round number that you're on. So even though we are on round 15, we're doing vine number 11. So vine 11 instructions are going to be work 6 single crochets. So I'll go ahead and work those. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Then around this next post stitch, we are going to work a V stitch. So across these next 3 stitches, it's going to be our V. So we will do a V stitch here. So we'll do our front post, skip that single, work a single into the next one, then a front post double around the same stitch we just made, or just worked around rather, and then we will skip this single crochet. Then we would work another single crochet, then we would work a front post double crochet around this one, and then we skip, and it will be one more single crochet. You should have worked a total of 12 stitches across these vine instructions. So I can count here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, because each vine is going to be a 12 stitch repeat. So once I do that, we should now find that we have 3 stitches, including this marked stitch. So if you have 3 stitches left to the stitch marker, you've done it correctly. So if you ever find that you're like, oh wait, there should be, 1, 2, 3, but I'm counting 4, or I'm only counting 2, you probably did some kind of error back here in this vine instruction. So you'll want to go back and check to see, did I do the correct number of single crochets after this stitch marker? Did I skip stitches I was supposed to? Things like that. So I'll go through that just one more time here, and then you should be good to go the rest of the round. So we'll do a 2 single crochets here. 1, 2. Then we'll work our front post double crochet. Make sure we move our stitch marker up into this stitch we just made to keep it in the same place. Then we will work vine 11 instructions. So that's going to be 6 single crochets, followed by a V-stitch around this next post stitch. And then a single crochet, front post double crochet, and then a final single crochet. And there I am. Now we have 3 more stitches to the stitch marker, and so we have done everything correctly. So that's all you do round 15. So I'm going to work up the rest of that. I'm going to work 15, 16, 17, and 18, which should all just be regular instructions. And then I will meet you back for round 19, where there can be a little bit of confusion with the instructions. So I want to make sure I walk you through those. I've just finished working up round 18, and now it's time to begin round 19, where there can be a little bit of confusion with how the instructions go, but don't worry, I am going to be walking you through all of the steps for it. So first, we're going to start off with 4 single crochets. So there's 1. Place my stitch marker into the beginning stitch. Then it's 2, 3, 4, which will take us to the stitch marker here, because that's going to be the one that we will skip when we work this front post double crochet. So I'll work my front post double crochet, take my marker, put it into that front post double crochet just made, so I know where to increase on the next round. Now, here's where vine 15 is going to be a little bit different. So vine 15 is going to kind of overlap into the next vine motif. So the first stitches of vine 15 are actually going to act as, sorry, what I mean by that is, I'm sorry, the last stitch of vine 15 is going to basically act almost like the first stitch of the next motif, and that means it'll turn out to be the first stitch of our next round. If you're not quite sure what that means, it's okay, we're going to see it happen. So for vine 15, what you do is you'll start by working a certain number of single crochets. So then that way we can be able to begin with our front post double here, leaning to the right. Then we will work 3 singles. Then we will work a front post double crochet, single crochet, front post double crochet, single crochet. So we're just basically repeating front post double crochets around these two with a single crochet in between. And then what you'll find is that after this stitch marker, we've already worked 12 stitches, but we still have 1 more stitch to make here around this post stitch. That's going to be our front post cluster that we're about to make. So technically, we're about to make 13 stitches, which means that we still have these 12 stitches, but this 13th one will act almost like the first stitch of the next repeat. So I'll go ahead and work my cluster. Okay, Once I do, I'll skip this stitch, and now we'll see that we no longer have 4 stitches to work before this stitch marker. We have 3 stitches to work. So now the repeat has changed to working 3 single crochets, then work this front post double crochet. So that's different from here where we had to work 4 single crochets, then the post stitch. So here we're just working 3 single crochets followed by our post stitch. So 3 singles, front post double crochet, and now we're back to working vine 15, which is going to have the 13 stitches here. So we're going to do our 4 single crochets, followed by our front post double crochet, 3 single crochets, then we will do a front post and a single twice, and now our 13th stitch slash the first stitch of our next motif here is going to be our front post cluster. Then we'll skip the single crochet behind it, and then now we'll have 3 stitches and then our stitch marker again. So that's going to be our repeat all the way to the end. Now, because the end is going to be different from our normal round endings, I'll go ahead and meet you up right before I work that ending to show you what to do to end round 17 of your yoke. I'm now here at the end of round 19, and I still have a few stitches left to work. So I've got one more front post double crochet, then I'll do a single crochet and then a front post cluster. Now notice that leaves me 3 stitches to work, but I only have 2 more stitches left before my stitch marker. So that's where this whole front post cluster being the first stitch of the next round comes in. So I'll go ahead and work my front post double crochet. Then I'll work my single crochet. And that single crochet will act as the last stitch of this round, and then the first stitch of the next round will be this front post cluster. So what I'll actually do is remove my beginning of round stitch marker, work my front post cluster, then I'm going to replace the beginning of round stitch marker into the top of this front post cluster to mark that that will be the beginning stitch of the current round. So our stitch count has not changed. It's still going to be whatever it was before without any increasing. And I'll still skip this first single crochet that's directly behind our cluster here. So I won't work into that one, but then the remainder of this round, which is round 20, we're going to do our increases the exact same way. The only difference is that I only have 3 single crochets before I need to work my increase, because that's the same as the distance that there was between the cluster and the marked stitch in the previous part of this round. So remember, we started with the extra stitch here at the beginning. So now that extra stitch has been accounted for behind this cluster. And so now we can work round 20 like normal. So we will work 3 single crochets, increase into that marked stitch, replace our stitch marker into the last single crochet we made, And then just repeat that process around. So we'll single crochet to the marker, increase, single crochet to the marker, increase, so on and so forth. And then when we get back here, our last stitch of the round is going to be this single crochet here. And then the first stitch of the next round will be worked in the top of this cluster. So I'm going to go ahead and work that off camera and then talk to you about what we do moving forward with the rest of our increasing. I've just finished working up round 20, so now I'm ready to begin round 21. But because rounds 21 through 32 all use techniques that we've already gone through with these previous rounds, I'm actually not going to walk you through step by step of any of those rounds going forward, but I do want to talk to you a little bit about this increasing pattern. So on your even numbered rounds, so that's going to be 22, 24, 26, etc., all the way up to 32, you'll continue doing the same thing. You're just going to work single crochets. You'll work a single crochet increase into your marked stitch, replace your marker into the last stitch made, and then just work single crochets again and repeat that. On your odd numbered rounds, you're just going to repeat the next vine pattern on this motif that's over here. And then this, you're just going to work however many single crochets, work a front post double crochet, and then it will list a number of single crochets that you need to work after this. If it doesn't list any, you just go straight into the next vine pattern. If it lists one single crochet, you'll make that single crochet before you start working the vine pattern, or two single crochets or however many. So just follow the instructions in your pattern. And once you reach the end of round 32, which I will be working to off camera, I will then return and talk to you about finishing the rest of your beautiful yoke. As you can see, I have finished working up all of my increases through round 32, and I'm now back at the beginning of the round. And what you can also see is that there are no longer any stitch markers marking my increases, because at this point, the remainder of the yoke is going to be done without any increasing whatsoever. So for the next several rounds, however many it is for your size listed in your pattern, you're just going to continue working in pattern. So you're going to alternate on the odd numbered rounds. You're going to work the next vine pattern. So in this case, I would be working the next vine pattern that involves this third cluster. Then I'm going to, on the even numbered rounds, just work single crochets in every stitch around and then repeat that. And you'll do that for however many are listed in your pattern. Now notice that there is quite a bit of things like the curling that's going on. That's going to happen. You're working on only one side of crochet, and so it naturally wants to curl anyway. You've got double the amount of rows on the ribbing that you do the amount of stitches, so it's going to cause this to kind of pucker and curl. That's okay. If it looks like that, it's fine. Your crochet is going to be smoothed and blocked out later when you're finished and you do your laundering and blocking and everything. So if it looks like mine, you're good. You're okay. You got it. You're on the right track is what I'm basically trying to say. So anyway, you've got quite a bit of work for you going forward. So go ahead and work up your rounds for your yoke. And once you reach that end, you'll come back and I will meet you to talk to you about how to then split your yoke to start forming the body and the sleeves of your sweater. I know that earlier I did show some repeating of the Vine 15 instructions where you've got that extra front post cluster that kind of overlaps into the next round, but that was during some increasing rounds, and I wanted to make sure I showed you on a non-increase round how Vine 15 is supposed to be worked, just because it can be a bit confusing. So I've already worked up to where I finished up my round or my row 14 of the Vine, which was just single crochets. So when you start the row 15 vine instructions, only in the very first one are you going to work 4 single crochets. So I'll work my first one here, place my stitch marker, and then I will work 2, 3, and 4. So I've worked 4 stitches. So now I'm going to be working my post stitches here. So we've got a front post double crochet, and then we'll work 3 single crochets, And then we will do a front post, single, front post, single. So front post, double crochet, single crochet, front post, double crochet, and a single crochet. Now, if we were going off of stitch counts right now, we have already reached 12 stitches, but we still have this extra little vine branch that needs a cluster on it. So that's going to be a 13th stitch that we'll have to put here. But that's okay, because what happens is this is the row, if you remember, where this final cluster on this last vine is going to act as the first stitch of the next round. So we're not actually increasing any of our stitch counts for this round. It's just going to overlap into the next one with this repeat. So we'll go ahead and work this cluster here. And then we will skip the stitch that's right behind it and go working into the next one. And we will find now that instead of having 4 single crochets before we work our front post stitch, we're only going to actually have 3. So we will work 3 single crochets now anytime we repeat this vine instruction. So 1, 2, 3. And then after those 3, that's when we will repeat this segment here where we do the front post, the 3 singles, front post single, cluster. And we'll keep doing that all the way around. And then our final cluster is going to be right here. And that will be the first stitch of the next round, just like it was back when I was showing you the cluster being worked on the increase rounds. That part has not changed. So that one you're still going to do. But from now on a regular non-increase round, you're going to work 4 single crochets just at the beginning. And then after this cluster, you're going to work 3 single crochets at the beginning of each of these new repeats, since this final cluster acts as that first stitch. So now that I've worked that, hopefully you should be able to work any repeat of the Vine row 15 instructions, knowing that the only time you do those 4 single crochets is at the very first one, and then everything else you're just doing those 3 single crochets after that final cluster. I've just finished working out my full yoke. As you can see, it's, curling in a bit like I've said before, but that's okay. I've now have the correct number of rounds, and it's time to split for the sleeves and the body. So one thing that I recommend in the pattern, as well as right here, is that you go ahead and figure out where you're going to be doing the splits and going ahead and putting a stitch marker to indicate where you need to skip stitches for your sleeves. So depending on your size, it will tell you to work a certain number of the vine motif, repeated a certain number of times. This will be worked across the back. So this will be the back of our sweater. And then you'll chain a certain amount, skip a certain number of stitches. If you'll notice, each one of those is divisible by 12 because that's how many of the vine motifs take up. So if, for instance, this one, I'm skipping 4 vine motifs because it says to skip 48 stitches for my size. So I go ahead and mark off where the first stitch of the skipped amounts are going to be. And then this is up to you. I went ahead and marked the last stitch of the skipped stitches because I want to work into the one after it. Or you could go ahead and mark that first one just to kind of remind you that that's the beginning of the motifs that you'll continue to work for the front of the sweater. In either case, whatever helps you be able to mark where you need to skip and then continue working, that's what matters. Then, of course, I come all the way back around, and then I have the other sleeve that I'll be skipping stitches of and creating a chain, and then I'll be back around to the beginning again. So I'm going to be showing you all of that here on camera now. Each size is going to be ending their yoke on a different vine row, so you're just going to continue the pattern with whichever is the next vine that you need to work. So for my size, I need to work the vine instructions where I start with a front post cluster here as my very first stitch. Then I'll go ahead and mark that as my first stitch of the round. And then I'll continue working this vine motif instruction. And it'll tell you exactly how many times you need to do that. So in my case, it says that I need to work it 7 times. So that's going to be 7 of these repeats. So I'll go ahead and work up those 7 repeats, and then I'll meet you back to show you what to do for the next step. I'm about to reach my first stitch marker indicating where I need to skip for the sleeves. So I'll work my final stitch there. And so I've worked all of my vine motif repeats. And now what it's going to tell me to do is to chain a certain number depending on my size. So this underarm chain is going to be where you can make some adjustments if you need to customize something like how big around the sleeves or the chest need to be, because it's really difficult to actually adjust here in the vine motif since they have to be a specific number and all of that stuff. But this underarm chain is where you can add a little bit of flexibility. So for my size, I need to chain 22. So I will chain 22 chains. And then once I have those 22 chains, I'm going to skip the number of stitches for my sleeve and then continue with my vine motif over here in the next set of stitches here. Now, because sometimes we might be starting with something like a cluster or a front post double crochet, that can be a bit tricky. So you just have to make sure you're very careful to keep this loop on your hook the same size and it doesn't stretch out or anything like that as you're trying to work things like yarn overs and things like that. Now, because I'm starting with the front post cluster, you're going to get to actually see that in action. So here we go. So for me to do my front post cluster, I'm going to hold this loop. Then I'm going to do my yarn over. Then I'm going to go and insert around my post and try to keep my stitches as close to each other as I possibly can. So that way they're all going to be the right size. So I'll pull through my 2, and I'm keeping everything up together here. So I'm not letting it slide too far back. I'm not letting the loops stretch or anything like that. Then I do my next one, go around, pull through 2, still holding on to those loops. So there's 2 done. And then I'll do 3. 4. And actually hold all of those there like that. Do a 5th one to finish up my cluster here. And I say on this part, if you're having to do something like me where you're doing a cluster or a front post double crochet, just go slowly, be patient. You may have to redo it a couple of times if you find that you're having a little bit of trouble. But once I have all of them there, I will then yarn over, pull through all of them. And I should now have my stitch made and the chains. And you can help it by kind of pushing your yoke and maybe even folding it to where it's going to start looking like it will when it's a sweater, so that it's not putting a bunch of stress onto the chain itself. So now we've got our sleeve opening right here. So we've got these underarm chains, we've got these stitches going around, and so that should be the total arm opening right there. All right, and then once I do that, I'm able to then continue by finding that, let's see, the stitch that I needed to skip. So this was the first stitch right here. So I'm going to skip that since I worked my cluster, and then I'm going to work my single crochet into the next one. And there we go. And then I'm going to work the rest of my vine pattern. And that's really all there is to it when you are working those chains and skipping those stitches. So then all you do is repeat exactly the same thing. So I'm going to work 7 of the vine motif instructions. And then I'm going to get to this point where I've marked, and I'm going to chain 22, skip all of these. Now, that will be then the end of this first setup round. Once I've ended that first setup round, the next setup round is just going to be working single crochets around. So I'm going to work all the way to where I'm going to make my chain, and I will be skipping these, and then I'll join back to show you how to then do the second setup round of single crochets. I've now worked my way all the way around, and I've done my final underarm chain here of 22, and I'm going to be skipping all of these stitches, and I will now be back to the beginning of round marker. So what we're going to do is work our second setup round by doing single crochets into this first stitch and all the stitches around and across the chains to begin the body of our sweater. So what I'll do is go ahead and remove my beginning of round stitch marker there. And then just like before, you're going to make sure you keep these chains close to your stitches so that there's not any stretching or warping or anything like that. And then we'll work a single crochet by going into our first stitch, pulling up our loop, keeping that chain close, yarning over, pulling through. And then now we will need to mark this as the first stitch of our new round. So I'll go ahead and grab my stitch marker here. Place that into that stitch as our first one. And then just like all of the even numbered rounds from before, this round is just working single crochets into all of our stitches across. But we are going to be doing something a little different when we get to the underarm chains. So I'm going to go ahead and work my single crochets across these vine motifs. Then I'll meet you back when I reach my first underarm chain and show you what to do there. I'm coming now to my final single crochets before we reach the chain. So we've got here 2 more single crochets to work. And now we have our underarm chains. So we have a couple of different options for what we can do here. So depending on how you want to work into the chains, as long as you're consistent, there's no real wrong way to do it as long as you're getting the same number. So for example, I have 22 chains across. So I need to work 22 single crochets into this chain until I reach this cluster stitch right here. That's going to be this V that's right here. So that's going to be the first time that I need to be back to my vine motif. So that means that this chain is going to be the last one I need to work into, and that needs to be chain or single crochet number 22. So you can work it either by going into just like this top loop right here. You could go under both loops and just have that one hump on the bottom. Or you could even, if you want to, you could flip it and work into that hump so that you have these two hanging out on the bottom to make it easier when you join for the sleeve later. It's really up to you. For me, I just find it easier to go ahead and work into just this top loop like I do normally anyway. So I'm going to just work a single crochet into that chain, and then find my next one and work a single crochet into that one. So that's 2. And then my next one, that's 3. 20. 21. And 22. So I can get it under there. There we go. So we have 22 So that matches up with my number of chains. And my last chain I just worked into is right before this cluster stitch. So it's before the very first stitch of this next motif. So now I can just work into that stitch like normal and single crochet. And now I'm back on track. So now I should be able to work single crochets once again into every stitch across. And we'll see now that our chain now has our single crochets worked across, and we're skipping working around these vines because those will be worked later when we go back and attach here to make the sleeve. So we're just going to leave those hanging out. I go ahead and leave my stitch markers in there just to indicate the first and last stitches of that sleeve round to help me later when it comes to joining those. It's optional for you if you want to or not. I just do it for myself because I know that I can sometimes miss where the first and last stitches are. But in either case, the rest of this setup round is exactly the same. You're just going to work single crochets again into every stitch across. And then when you get to your underarm chain, work into it exactly the same. Once you do that, you are then done with your setup and you will be ready to begin your body. To work the body, I'm going to talk to you about this next part and how to read these charts. So each one of these charts is based on each different size. So as you can see here, we've got sizes extra small and small. You'll be able to access whichever one you are working in your pattern. But if you'll notice that each one of these columns has a number inside of it, and notice along the bottom here, it says back and it says front. That's because when you're working the body, you're going to be working from right to left. And at your beginning of round, you're going to be on the back of the sweater. So you'll be working these motifs, these vine motifs. You'll work the side panel, then you'll work the front with the vine motifs, and then you'll work another side panel, and then you'll be all the way back here to the beginning. And you just keep going around and around like that, building your rounds and moving on to the next vine pattern. But you'll notice here that each one lists a different round number. That's going to be the round where you will actually end that vine motif. So on the back, our very first vine motif goes nearly all the way to the end of the sweater. So the extra small goes all the way to 62 rounds. 61 is the last one. Then you'll work one more round for 62, and then you'll immediately be to your bottom ribbing. But then there are some here that are going to end a little earlier than that in order to create this very like asymmetrical, organic kind of flowy thing going on here. And notice that the front does the exact same thing, but just mirrors it on the opposite, in the opposite direction. So when it says to work up to a certain round number, what that means is you're going to work the vine motif all the way to there, and then you should end either on a vine 9 or a vine 19, in which case, instead of working the regular instructions, you're actually going to work the end instructions where you'll replace it with a cluster. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and work up my sizes vine motifs on the body, and then I'll show you how to do that kind of vine ending thing. But the next thing I actually want to do, because that's going to happen sooner, is talk to you about how to do the decreasing in order to create that tapered waist for our sweater. Now that I'm done making my setup rounds and I'm ready to start making the body, I've already gone over how we're going to do the vine motifs, but now I do want to talk to you about doing the decreasing along the sides to create that tapered waist look. Now you can customize here and decide if you don't want that tapered waist, you can just ignore these instructions. Just keep working regular single crochets across the underarm side panel here, and then work the vine motif as you are following along. But for those of you who do want that tapered waist, I'm going to show you how to do that. So the first thing is that when we're working across the back of our panel, or back of our sweater, sorry, we're going to work our vine motifs like normal. So in this case, my next one is going to be the single crochet, the cluster, single, all that stuff. And you just repeat that all the way across until you get to the opposite side. And then once you reach that opposite side, you'll be back to the underarm chain, which is going to be one of your sides. And it'll say in your instructions that you will decrease well, actually you'll work a certain number of non-decrease rounds, and then you'll work a decrease round. I'm not on to an actual decrease round, but I am going to go ahead and demonstrate that for you so you'll know what to do when you do reach that. So for example, if your size says work, 4 rounds of non-decrease and then 1 round of decrease, you'll work 4 rounds of just straight single crochets across this part here, and then work the vine motifs on the other side. And then when you decrease on that 5th round, then you're going to do the following. So we're going to do what's called an invisible decrease. In the pattern, I call it a single crochet decrease, but the traditional way of decreasing is that you would essentially work 2 incompleted single crochets across these stitches. But to me, that looks a little bit too conspicuous, and so I like to do the invisible one. This is a modified form of what's done a lot in amigurumi. So to show you, I'm going to get closer here. And then I'm going to show you that you would first find this stitch right here, and we're going to decrease it by going through just the front loop of this single crochet. So I'm going through just the front loop. Then, without yarning over or anything, we're going to just move our hook to where it's now going to go under both loops of the second stitch. So now we're going to be under the front loop of this first stitch and both loops of the second one. And now I'm going to complete my single crochet. So I'm going to yarn over, pull a loop through the 2 stitches that are on my hook. Sometimes I find if I go forward this way, kind of turn and go backward this way, and then twist it forward, it pulls through both of those stitches. And what that does is it pulls that front loop over to kind of fill in this gap right here that would normally form if I tried to work these 2 separately, but still decreases it from 2 stitches down to 1 stitch. Then I just yarn over and pull through my 2 loops like normal. And now I have 1 less stitch on this side. Then what I'll do is I'll work single crochets across the rest of these stitches under the arm. Until you have 2 stitches remaining before you begin the vine motifs on the front of the sweater. So the way to kind of tell that is if you look, you can find, okay, so my very first stitch is going to be here. Now what you might do is you might go ahead and put a stitch marker into here, but one thing I want you to make sure you're careful with is that this does not look like you're beginning a round stitch marker, because you don't want to accidentally treat this as the beginning of a new round. You want to know, oh, that's just actually the front where I'm going to start the new vine motif. But in either case, however you want to do it, once you reach these last 2 stitches, we're just going to do our decrease the exact same way. So we're going to go through the front loop of our first stitch, swing our hook around and go through both loops of our second stitch. So now we'll be under 3 loops, yarn over, pull through all 3 of those loops there, and then yarn over and pull through 2 loops, and we will have decreased 2 single crochets down to 1 single crochet. And then I'll just continue working my regular vine motifs across the front. So that's how you would do any decreasing on your decreasing round. You work your vine motifs across the back, decrease in the first 2 stitches on the underarm, single crochet across the underarm to the last 2 stitches, work your decrease, and then continue with the vine motif on the front. Repeat that on the opposite side with the other underarm, and then you'll be back to the beginning of the round. And then you're ready to just continue the next round going as you need to go. The final thing I want to show you about working the body is how to work the vine ends whenever you actually get to the end of a motif. So let's say, for instance, on here, I am on a round where I'm supposed to end one of my motifs. So I've already gone ahead and worked these 2 like normal, but then let's say this is the motif that I need to end based on my chart instructions. So what we're going to do is we'll be working everything like we did before, except instead of working these V stitches, we're going to be replacing these with a cluster just to kind of terminate this final vine. So to do that, we're just going to work 2 there. And by the way, this will be true whether or not the V stitch is over here on the left or if the V stitch is over here on the right. In either case, you're going to replace it the exact same way that I'm going to show you here. So I'll go ahead and work my stitches here. And then at this point, if I was on vine 9 or vine 19, it might say, okay, now you would work a V-stitch across these next 3. But instead what we'll do is we'll replace that with a single crochet, front post cluster, single crochet. So I'll work a single crochet into the next one, then work my front post cluster around the next post stitch. Skip the one that's behind it and then work my single crochet. And then I'm back to being able to work the next motif like normal. So now that we've ended with this final cluster here, what we're going to now do is we'll no longer need to attach any more new stitches to this vine motif. Instead, we'll replace it with just 12 regular single crochets anytime I come across this section. So in the future, when I work my next round of just single crochets, and then the following round, I'm going to continue with the next vine row. I would work the vine row here. I'll work my vine row instructions here, but then here I'm just going to just single crochet 12 across, skipping that one, then work the next vine on the next one. And so that way you can see anytime you have this cluster, you don't work any more of that vine motif, but you still count it in the vine section as 12 stitches. So I'm going to continue now that I've seen my chart and I know my decrease pattern. I'm going to continue working the rest of my body off camera. And if you need help with any of those parts, you can always go back, look at how I explain how to read the chart, look at how I explain how to do the decreases, and you should be able to do the rest of the body on your own as well. So I'm going to go ahead and work up the remainder of my body off camera, and then I will meet you back to show you how to do the ribbing along the bottom. I have just finished working at my body, and as you can see, I've got all of my nice vine motifs going in the little cascading pattern we've got here, and I've ended all of them and then worked up the rest of the body rounds after that. And now I'm ready to begin the bottom ribbing. So to do that, we're going to actually go ahead and remove our beginning of round stitch marker. We won't need that anymore for our body. Insert my hook into my yarn here. And then because we worked our rounds continuously, one of the things we'll want to do to kind of remove this little jog that can happen where you've got one side that's going to be slightly higher than the other, we're just going to slip stitch into that very first stitch of the round. And that kind of evens out that jog a little bit. And then when we do our ribbing, it's going to hide that even more. All right, so to do our ribbing, we're going to do a join as you go ribbing, so we don't have to do anything separate to sew on later. And it's going to be worked very similarly to how we did the collar, but we're going to need to do a couple of extra steps to have it joined to the side of our body here. So the first thing is that you can really make this ribbing as long as you want to. You can make it really short, you can make it really long. It just depends on the look you're going for or how long you need the sweater to be. Keep in mind that we are going to also block this. So if you're like, oh, it's maybe a little short or a little long, it's okay. Just remember like what the measurements are going to be, and you'll be able to figure out what kind of ribbing you want to do. But for me, I go ahead and I'm going to chain 15. And then kind of tighten that last one down. And then we're going to work a slip stitch ribbing like we did with the collar. So in this case, we're going to now have 14 chains to work into. So I'll go ahead and work those 14 slip stitches. So there's 1, 2, 3, 13, and 14. Okay. Now, there's going to be 2 ways we're going to be joining, because the way that these slip stitch rows are going to be, they are going to be fairly short. So we don't need to, so we need to make sure that we're not putting too few rows on here, because otherwise that might cause the bottom of the sweater to cinch in a little too tight. But we don't want to do it the same way we did with the collar, because we also don't want it to be baggy and loose at the bottom. We do want it to bring it in and really hug the hips and give it that nice tapered fitted look. So we're going to be alternating how we join to the bottom here. So the first one you're going to do is slip stitch along the next 2 stitches of the body. So we're going to find these next 2 stitches here, and we're going to just slip stitch tightly into those, because these are not ones we are going to be working into later. We want them to be tight so that they're joining the ribbing nice and tightly to the body. There we go. So there's 2. And then we're going to turn our work. And then skipping those 2 slip stitches along the body, we're going to work slip stitch ribbing into the other 14. So we're going to slip stitch in the back loop only of each of these slip stitches. There we go. So once again, we're going to do 14, or however many that you made your ribbing for. And just like with the collar, I'm not going to lie, this part also kind of sucks. It looks really good, but it is very time consuming. And I will say, I think even compared to the body, this is one of the longer parts of making this sweater. But again, it's definitely worth it for the look in the end, for that nice, clean, tight ribbing that you get. All right, and very last one here. And this will get a little bit easier once there's more to hold on to. Right now, it's a little fiddly because there's just not a whole lot of the ribbing to hold on to while I'm working. But there we go. All right, so then once you do that, you are then going to turn and you're going to chain 1, and you'll just repeat that again, where you will work slip stitches in the back loop only all the way across. So let me find my back loops here. There we go. Now, to show you something, so one thing is that sometimes you're like, wait, which one's the actual back loop of the slip stitch and which one's just like the V that's being created on the front? So a way to kind of tell is if you go and look at where your active loop is coming out of, it should be coming out of the middle of this V from our turning chain, and then that is coming out of the middle of this V. So this V is what indicates the top of our slip stitch. So if you're ever like, I'm not exactly sure which one to put it into, that's a way you can do, is just follow the path of your loops until you find the first stitch, and then you can see, oh, that's where I need to insert my hook, is that back loop right there. So that's just a little tip for, well, I should probably have my yarn going to the correct direction there. Okay. There we go. Oh, wait, no, that was, forgive me, I'm a little bit of a mess. Hold on. All right, I fixed that. So now we're able to do a slip stitch into the back loop only of my slip stitch here. There we go. I'm coming now to where I'm finishing up this row of ribbing. Got one more to insert into. There we go. And now the next thing we'll do is, so the first time we would slip stitch twice along the bottom of our sweater. This time we're actually only going to slip stitch once along the bottom of our sweater. I found that when I was working this pattern up, that gave the ribbing a good, like, still like a tight fit. But if I did it every 2, it made it too tight. So that's why I alternate between slip stitching 2 and then slip stitching 1 along the bottom. Now, because that can be a bit of a pain trying to remember, oh wait, did I slip stitch 2 or 1 last time? What I'll do is once I slip stitch 1, I go ahead and take that beginning of round stitch marker because we weren't using it for beginning of round anymore. And I'll actually mark where I'm going to put my last slip stitch in. So I just did 1. So now I know that the next one has to be 2. So I find that I go 1, 2, place my stitch marker in there, and that'll remind me when I get back down this row that I need to slip stitch into the next 2. Then once I do that, I move this into just the next one to remind me that, I only need to slip stitch into 1. And then I move it 2, and then I move it 1, and then I move it 2. So I just keep moving this stitch marker into the next one to remind me that I need to do 2 or 1 slip stitches along the bottom. Now, I'm going to go ahead and work the remainder of this off camera, and then I'll meet you back to show you how to do the joining once we get all of our ribbing done. This is going to take me a while, and it'll take you a while too, so definitely be patient, take some time, put on, a good show or podcast or whatever it is that you do to entertain yourself while you're crocheting, and just have some fun slowly working up this beautiful slip stitch ribbing. And then I will meet you back to talk about joining. All right, that was quite the journey there. I finished working up all of the slip stitch rows for my ribbing, and it's nice and stretchy, and it doesn't pull it in too tight, but it's also not too loose. And so now I'm ready to do the joining. So what we're going to be doing is joining like we did when we did the rib collar, exactly the same way. So what we'll do is, now that I've slip stitched to the bottom here, we are, sorry, I did not. I need to do that. We're actually going to find kind of this bottom stitch right here where our very first row of slip stitches is kind of around. And this one you can just kind of eyeball. You could go here, here. It doesn't really matter. The point is that you just want to slip stitch once to give yourself a nice little turning chain. And then we're going to do like we did with the neck, and we're going to go with this last row of our slip stitches on top of this row, so our very first row, and then we're going to join them by going through the front of this slip stitch row. So if we kind of look here, we've got, trying to get it to work. Okay, sorry. This can be a little bit fiddly, but it should work just fine. We can find, okay, so we've got these V's that we're going to be going through. And then what I want to do is find where the front of those are, which is going to be these V's right here. And we're just going to slip stitch those together. So I'm going to go ahead and go through that very first one under both loops, and then through this first kind of chain that we had right here, making sure we're layering them on top of each other, and then yarn over and just slip stitch all of that together. Now my first one was a little tight, so I might have to do that didn't get it. Okay, yeah, I might have to do a pull through. It's not one motion. I might have to just pull it one at a time. One through there. And as you can see, if you're having a little bit of trouble with this part, that is okay. Obviously, it's not the easiest thing to do here. Okay, and then go through there. Okay, I think I actually caught, yeah, I need to go through that loop. There we go. Okay. Woo, all right, so I went through everything, and now I have my loop, my active loop here, and I'm just going to repeat that again. I'm going to go find the next stitch that needs to be put into, and that's going to be this V. So right here, insert my hook through there. And if you honestly need to, you can even just go just like through the front loop if going through both loops is too much. And then still going through the front of this row and then slip stitching that together. That should also work as well. In fact, I actually think I'm going to do that myself here. Go through that front loop. And then through the next chain of our first row, and then just slip stitch that together, and then just keep doing that all the way across our ribbing. Oh yeah, that's way easier. Okay, getting to where we are working these last three. They're kind of small, so you may have to do some stretching and manipulating to be able to get into those last two slip stitches. But once you do, just go nice and slowly, join like you've been doing. All right, I've got one more. And this one, right here. And then through this very last one. And voila, we have now joined our slip stitch ribbing together. And it creates a fairly invisible join without any seaming. There is a slight bit of gapping here, but you can always tighten that up by maybe sewing these ridges on the back here together. So then that way they can maybe cinch in a little bit more. And so you can leave yourself a little bit of extra tail to be able to go back and do that. So I'm going to go ahead and snip off my yarn, pull that through. And I am now ready to move on to the next step, which is going to be starting the sleeves. To begin our sleeves, the first thing that we're going to need to do is lay out our sweater and identify where the right and the left sleeves are. So what you're going to do is first determine where the front of your sweater is, because that's going to help us figure out where our left and our right are. So the front of the sweater is going to be where you'll see the shorter vines. So the vines will end on the left side here, and then they work their way down. And so these longer vines end down here. So once you figure out that that's the direction of the vine pattern, that helps us determine that this is the front. And then that tells us that this side with the long vines is going to be our left sleeve. And the side where we've got the shorter vines is going to be the right sleeve. Honestly, this is equal on both sides, how I've designed it. So really you could determine whichever side you want it to be. But because of how I wrote the instructions, I identify the left sleeve as the one with the long side or the long vines, and the right sleeve with the short vines. So that's going to help us understand how to do the chart and how to work the sleeves. So I'll go ahead and start by showing you how to read the chart. This style of chart should look very similar to the ones we did for the body, and so you should be able to read them kind of the same way. The only difference is going to be that we're not talking about the front and the back anymore. We're talking about how to work the right sleeve and the left sleeve. Now, you're not working the right and left sleeve at the same time. This was just for me to be able to save space in the format. I just put both of them on here and identified which one's the right sleeve, and you still work in this direction, and which one's the left sleeve, and you still work in this direction. So as you're working the left sleeve, for example, you'll work the underside, which I'll be showing you how to do. Then when you get to the vine motifs, you're going to just work these 4 vine motifs just like normal, and you keep doing that around and around until you reach these round numbers, and that will tell you that that's the last time you need to work that vine motif. So that tells you, oh, on round 51, we need to end this vine motif, keep going with these, and then end the one on this side, and then you just keep doing that all the way to the end of the sleeve. And then if you're working the right sleeve, you can see it's much shorter because the right sleeve is the side with all the short vines, and then the left sleeve should be on the side with the long vines, so it's continuing that short to long pattern that we've got going on. To begin the sleeves, what you're going to do is get back your beginning of round stitch marker, because we are going to need that, because we'll continue to work rounds continuously for the sleeve like we did for the body and the yoke. And of course your size 4mm hook, or whatever size you've been using. And then you just determine which sleeve you want to work on first. It doesn't really matter as long as you make sure you're following the correct instructions for your sleeve so that you're using the correct chart. So for me, I'm going to go ahead and go on the long vine side, and I'm going to do the left sleeve first. So I'll go ahead and find my left sleeve opening here. And notice that we have our underarm chain going here. And then we have our stitches that were from the yoke that we skipped earlier. So this is going to be where we will work around. And the key thing is when we locate our underarm chain, we're going to find the actual chains here, and we're going to find where the center is. So our center is just going to be halfway between our chains. So for instance, if you chained 18 for your size, then that means that there should be 9 chains on each side of that center. And notice that I still have my stitch marker here to remind me that this was the first skipped stitch for the sleeve. So that means that the first chain is not going to be this one right here, because that was the stitch that was worked into the body. So I go over here and see, okay, here's my first chain kind of right here. So once I find my center stitches here, it's going to be these two right here. If I'm right-handed, I'm going to be going into this left one because I'll be working my way this way. If you're left-handed, you'll start on the one to the right because you'll work your way around this way. So I'm going to go ahead and insert my hook here, and then I just join with a slip stitch. And then I will chain 1 to secure that. Then into the same stitch, I'm going to work a single crochet. And now I will go ahead and take my beginning of round stitch marker here and place it into that first single crochet so I know where it will continue to the next round. Then what I do is I will work single crochets across my chain. In this case, I will have about 9, like I said earlier. So there's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Oh, come on. Oh, yarn splits. Don't you hate them? Okay, 8. And hold on, let me count. 7. Oh, okay, yeah. Okay. So I need to do, that's 8. And then 9. Okay. So now I'm here to where I've got this jump that's going to happen basically from my current stitch right here all the way to the first stitch of the sleeve. And if I would just went ahead and did a single crochet, that's going to leave us a pretty big gap in between, this big gap that's going to be right here. So one of the tips I offer in the written pattern, and one that I've learned from other crochet designers and practicing on my own, is that you can close this gap up by doing a few like single crochets together, almost like a decrease, before it creates this very first stitch. Now to do this, you're not actually decreasing the stitch count, you're just using a decrease method to close up this gap, and I'll show you how to do that. So what I'm gonna notice is that there's like 1, maybe 2, 3 little places where I could maybe put a stitch into. They're not exactly stitches or chains or anything that count for anything, but those are making up that gap before I get to this first stitch. So I will start by inserting into the first of these, pulling up a loop, and then going into the next one and inserting and pulling up another loop. Then going into the next one, inserting and pulling up another loop. And I've got all these loops on my hook, but what these loops are going to do is fill in that space with yarn, so then that way it doesn't look as obvious that that's the corner gap. And then in this first stitch of my sleeve section, I will insert for one more time, pull up a loop, and then I will just pull that all together with one more yarn over. And there we go. And now I've got one stitch. So we have only one chain or one V right here to indicate that it's one stitch. But notice that all of these loops that we made cover up this space right here in the corner. And now I can continue working my stitch pattern. So notice that now I'm back over to where we are at the vine motif. So this is the first stitch of that vine motif. So if that's the first stitch of my vine motif, I need to look to see, okay, what row am I on? Does the first stitch need to be a single crochet? Do I do any more single crochets? If you're one of the ones, like the sizes, where this is a row 9 or 19 where you have to work a cluster, then once you do those yarn over loops through here, you then will actually work your cluster before doing your final yarn over. And I can even show you what that looks like just in case. So here we go. So let's say I have all of these yarn overs here. So I would just go in and do, okay, so it was this one, this one, this one. Then if my very first stitch was the front post cluster here, I would go ahead and just work my front post cluster. I'm just going to do 3 just to show you. Okay. It's going to be a lot of loops on your hook, but that's okay, because in the end, all you really care about is just turning them into a single stitch, and those extra loops will just fill in that space and you'll still get your cluster right where it needs to go. But I do not need a cluster in mine, so I'm going to go ahead and just undo that and go back and just work my regular single crochet with these little yarn overs through there. And now I'm ready to continue my vine motif. So you'll continue your vine motif, however many repeats around for your sleeve size. Then when you get to the very last vine motif of your sleeve, we're then going to need to work across the second half of our chain. So I'm going to go ahead and work up my vine motifs across this sleeve, and then I'll meet you back up to show you how to finish out the sleeve round. I just finished working across the vine motifs. I have one more stitch left before the end of it. And now we can see that we've reached back around to where we now have our chains that we worked for the underarm, and then we'll have this gap right here. So because this gap includes that cluster there, what I'm actually going to do in order to find my, or to do my, to like all those yarn loops, I'm not going to work into this big gap right here, because then it basically does no good. I'm actually going to find a random loop down here. So maybe just like into this back loop here of that stitch, and then pull my yarn through to create my yarn over, and that fills that gap a little bit better than if I had just gone straight into that hole. Then I'll find the next one, maybe this kind of stitch looking thing right here, and then maybe right here. That's a little too loose. I might do, let's go maybe right here below it, and then there we go. Okay, then I'll be back to my chains. So now there should be the same number of chains that I plan to work into. So I should have 9, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Notice that there's maybe one extra here that I didn't quite account for. No big deal. I will simply do one more yarn over, and then I'm ready to do 9 stitches. So I'll go into here, pull up my loop. I've got all these loops on my hook, and then pull through all of those. And as you can see, it just pulls it all together with all those yarn loops. Notice I didn't have the same exact amount as I did in this gap, and that's okay. You don't have to. It just has to cover that gap the way that it just has to cover the gap. That's all it needs to do. So then once I do that, I'm ready to start working my next single crochet here. So that's my second one. And 9, there we go. All right, and then I should be back to my beginning of round stitch marker. So then I'm just going to do what I've been doing before. I'll just remove that. And then without any joining or chaining or anything, you just start working your next single crochet into that very first stitch. And then we make sure that we mark that as the first stitch of the round. Okay. But before I continue, one of the other things that you need to know is that your sleeve is going to be decreased to create a tapered sleeve. We're not wanting any big loose sleeves. We want it to be a nice trim fit. So I'm going to show you what to do when it comes to a decrease round. So I'll go back to my last stitch here. So anytime that the pattern tells you to decrease for your size, so each size is going to have a different decrease pattern, but all the sizes work their decrease rounds the exact same way. So on any decrease round, in our very first stitch, before we move on, we're actually going to do an invisible decrease. So we'll do it like we did when we did the waist shaping. We're going to insert into the front loop of that very first stitch, then keep inserting into both loops of the next stitch to create our invisible decrease. Then we'll yarn over, pull through both of those, and that will join our first 2 stitches of the round together, yarn over, and then pull through those 2 loops. And then we will mark this decrease as the first stitch of the round. Then you just work the rest of the sleeve in pattern like normal. So you'll work single crochets across this underarm. Then when you get to your vine motifs, your sleeve, your actual sleeve section, you'll work across that, and then you'll work all the way back around to the end. Now when you get all the way to the end, I'm just going to kind of shortcut it here just to show you how it works. So let's say I'm over here and I'm single crocheting along, single crocheting along. What you're going to do is stop at these last 2 single crochets of your round. So it's going to be the last 2 stitches before your stitch marker for beginning of round. All you do then, once you reach these last 2, is perform a final single crochet in decrease by going through the front loop and both loops of the next one. So front loop of the first one, 2 loops of the next one, and then yarn over, pull through, yarn over, pull through 2, and then we're back to the beginning of our round. So that will decrease it by 2 stitches, one on this side, one on this side, and then you just continue your next round like normal. So you would remove your stitch marker and then just beginning working single crochets into all of that. So quick recap for decrease. When you reach the very last stitch of the previous round, you don't work just a single crochet in that first stitch. You're going to work an invisible decrease. You'll work the front loop and both loops together. Then work in pattern all the way around the sleeve. Then when you get to the last 2 stitches before the stitch marker, you're then going to decrease by doing the invisible single crochet decrease of those 2. And then you'll put your stitch marker into the first stitch of the next round and then just keep going like normal. So I'm going to go ahead, and that's going to be the same for both sleeves. So the only thing that'll be different is the vine motif will be different when you do the right sleeve. And so everything else though, as far as the structure, like joining the underarm chains, the gaps in the corners, all of that is going to be exactly the same. So you now have everything you need to know to be able to work up the sleeves. So I'm going to go ahead and work up my sleeves off camera, and then I will come back and talk to you about doing the sleeve cuffs. All right, I just finished working up my first sleeve and I'm now ready to begin the cuff. So the great thing about the cuff on these sleeves is that they are worked exactly the same as the bottom ribbing after the body. So we're going to start the same way. We're going to start with a slip stitch into that very first stitch just to even out that jogging from working rounds continuously. And then depending on how long you want your cuffs to be, you still just chain whatever amount that you want to do. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and chain 15. And then starting in the second chain from the hook, I'm going to insert a nice loose slip stitch that I will be able to work into later. And then just keep entering slip stitches all the way down. And then just like with the bottom, once I get here to the end, I'm going to then alternate between slip stitching 1 and 2 along the side of my cuff here, and then alternate that all the way around, working rows back and forth until I get all the way to the end, and then I just join the same way. Now, because this is exactly the same as the bottom ribbing, rather than duplicating the same instructions here, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you the timestamp where you can go back to rewatch the bottom ribbing and see how to do that just here on the cuff. And then once you do that, you'll work your other sleeve, do the cuff for that one, using the exact same instructions as we just went over here. And then we'll be ready to finish our sweater with some nice blocking. After finishing making your sweater, a very important step is going to be the blocking process. If you'll notice, all of the vines that you are working tend to kind of scrunch everything in. So we need to block it so that we can stretch it out and open it up and get this to fit the measurements that we want it to fit. So we're going to need a blocking mat, some blocking pins, and then I like to use a fan to help kind of like get this thing dry a little bit faster. Since it's a pretty thick sweater, it will take a little while. So you definitely want to make sure you get as much air going over it as possible. So one thing you want to do is to take care of the width. We want to make sure that the chest is as wide as we need it to be. So for example, if I'm doing the size medium, which is about 42.5 inches, then we are going to want to make sure that we get half of that. So I'm going to go with about, like, if I round that up, like 42.5, it's about 21. So I maybe do like about 22 inches. So if you follow along with these grid lines here, each one of these is 1 inch or about like 2.5 centimeters roughly. Then you can take the chest area and stretch it out and find, okay, so we've got ish. Okay, so I'll make sure that they go about here and here. So I'm gonna just like remember that. So this one's going to go here. Go ahead and take one of my knit blockers here. I'm going to pin this side of the chest to about there. And then pin the other one on the opposite side to that one mark that I had. Okay, so get that out to about here. And then the rest of the sweater, you're going to just kind of stretch in place to line up with that. So I know that we've got this tapered waist going on, so I don't want it to stretch all the way out, but I do want to at least have it follow that tapered angle the way that I want. So I'm going to do this. And that's essentially just all this step is just stretching and shaping the sweater to where it's going to fit the size that we want it to fit and really open up this nice cable pattern. So you can really clearly see these vines with all of their clusters and their organic moving in and out and things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and finish blocking this part of the sweater. And then, oh, sorry, I forgot. There's one more thing to also note is the length. So because we want to make sure that this is the correct length, I need it to go from the underarm to here. It needs to be about 12 inches. So I can see I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And it's actually gone a little bit past that, which is okay. It can be a little bit longer. And then I just want to make sure that the bottom here lines up nice and straight. So actually I'm going ahead and move that here so that it doesn't have that curve in it that it had earlier. And make sure you're grabbing both parts of the ribbing when you're doing this part. There we go. Another thing that you'll want to make sure that you do is this collar can sometimes have this tendency to kind of curl outward. We don't really want that unless you really like that look, and you can, but I really want people to be able to see that detail where the ridge is connected to the vines here. So I want to make sure that this collar is actually facing inward. So I'm going to make sure I go and pin these to where they're actually facing in, like that. And then if you need to, you could carefully, if you have like a steamer or something like that, you could carefully like steam that part as well, just to make sure it really lies nice and flat. But hopefully this should get our collar to do what we want it to do. There we go. All right, got that down. Okay, and then the next step would be something like making sure that the shoulders are coming out as far as we want them to go. And then the sleeves, you can, the sleeves, you can pin into place as far as like the length and the width and everything. You just kind of like get these to go however you need to. They're going to be fine here at the top, but I mostly want to make sure at least that the wrists are nice and wide and comfortable. So I'll go ahead and pin those. There we go. Just take your time with this process. If you find that you don't really like the way that it's shaped a particular way, you can always unpin and repin. So I'm going to go ahead and set the rest of that up. All right, I believe I have it pinned how I would like so that it'll be the right width, the right length. The collar should lie flat. The sleeves should be a good width to fit comfortably around the arms, and I am happy with it. So now my final step is going to be to set my fan up to where it's going to blow air across this so that it can give it a chance to be able to dry a little bit more quickly. But once you do that, you're able to then unpin it, take it off of your board, and ready to wear. So I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial video and that you found it helpful. If you did, please like and subscribe. And if you can, please make sure that if you do make this sweater and you post it on social media, you can tag me on Instagram at The Cocky Crocheter. And I would love to be able to see all of your makes because I really enjoyed designing this. And I definitely want to see all the beautiful work that you're going to do with your very own Vinland sweater. Thank you and have a wonderful day.